Oh god, that went into the fire.
Hi, my name is Rachel and welcome to the Sago Show, where we're exploring the roots and digging deeper into the history behind some of our favorite Filipino dishes and sweets. Today, we're going to be making sinigang na salmon, a tamarind-based soup with vegetables and, of course, salmon. To get started, we're going to bring a pot of water to a boil and very confidently drop in pieces of peeled and cut taro for about 7 minutes so that it will be cooked in time to add to the sinigang. Next, let's start preparing the salmon. We're going to fry the salmon pieces before adding it to the sinigang so that everything stays intact. This also reduces some of the fishy flavor that you can get when you add the salmon directly to the soup. This salmon head is super inexpensive and you can ask for this at the counter at the grocery store. And I'm also adding in salmon scraps, which were also very cheap and add a little more meat that you can add to the soup. First, I've cleaned and dried the salmon pieces, and I'm going to toss them in 1 tablespoon of salt, a teaspoon of pepper, and about 1/4 cup of cornstarch. Sinigang is commonly made with pork or beef as the star, but I love salmon, so I've always been partial to this version. It's interesting though, because salmon is not a fish that is local to the Philippines, so how did salmon sinigang come to be? First, let's start frying the salmon in vegetable oil over medium-high heat until it just gets crispy on the outside. To understand salmon sinigang, we need to go back to the start of the 20th century, when Filipino communities are forming in Alaska. However, it is said that Filipinos actually started arriving in Alaska by merchant ships as early as the late 1700s. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, commercial fishing companies had long used Asian migrant workers to do labor that was typically undesired, such as cutting and canning the fish. After exclusion acts in 1882 and in 1924 prevented Chinese and Japanese workers from immigrating to the US, more Filipinos started to come to the US to fill these positions at canneries. Native Alaskans were also filling these roles as well. Not only did Asian and Native Alaskan workers have the least desirable jobs at the canneries, they also had worse conditions compared to their white counterparts. For example, while white workers stayed in housing that had heating, the Filipino workers lived in crowded housing that didn't have access to even showers or heat. And for food, a lot of the time they had to rely on just servings of fish and rice. That's why it's said that salmon sinigang came from this community of workers who were making scraps into a familiar meal. And so now that we've pre-cooked both the taro and the salmon, we're ready to start working on the sinigang. I'm going to bring 2 liters of water to a boil, and then add the onions, tomatoes, sinigang packet, and 2 tablespoons of miso paste. Now traditionally, sinigang is made with an actual tamarind or guava paste, and that's what creates that sour flavor. However, I'm not going to be making my own homemade paste today. I'm just going to be using a packet. This is what my mom uses, and it's really easy to find these packets at a store or a market that sells Asian food. And so I mentioned that the Alaskeros, who are the Filipinos that are residing in Alaska, were in very poor working and living conditions. And the environment became even more abusive once the Great Depression hit. Alaskeros began to organize, and they formed a union to combat labor contractors, fighting for increased pay and better living conditions. Their fight certainly did not come without obstacles, because the Depression meant that labor contractors did have the upper hand, and they could take advantage of workers. The union later lost its president in Virgil Duyungan when he was murdered by the nephew of a labor contractor in 1936. Yet still, the workers continued to fight even through the 1980s. And back to my sinigang, I've let this simmer for about 10 minutes to really develop the flavor. And next what I'm going to do is add in my vegetables. So here I'll add my daikon, string beans, and spinach or whatever leafy green you're using. And we'll also add in our taro, which is already mostly cooked at this point. Simmer this for just about 5 minutes. I chose to present sinigang na salmon because it's such an interesting embodiment of this intersection of people, place, and time in Filipino-American history. I think it's important to know about the Alaskeros and be informed of the mark that Filipinos have had in American history, and know the work that Filipinos have been doing towards organizing and fighting for workers' rights. These stories aren't always told to us in school, and for me, as someone who is a millennial, first generation born in the US, if we don't know these stories, then we might not know the unity and the perseverance that Filipinos have had for over a century in the United States. And even more than that, I don't want us to think about all of these issues as just existing in the past. Labor rights and the involvement of Filipinos is not just something that was happening in the past, it's relevant today. Our history isn't just in the Philippines, it's here in America, and it has been here for a long time. To finish up my sinigang, the vegetables are cooked, so I'm going to add in the salmon and just bring it up to heat for about 3 minutes because this is already cooked. And I'll serve this with a scoop of rice. I'll make sure that I have a saucer of patis close by and really enjoy this because it's great for the fall. It's great really any time of year, but I love how warm it makes me feel, and I love the taste of the salmon with sinigang. What's your favorite type of sinigang? And did you already know about the history of Filipinos working in Alaska? Let me know in the comments. I've really enjoyed hearing from folks this season, and I'm so grateful for you watching. I'd really appreciate if you could take the time to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and make sure to set your notifications so that you can stay plugged in for the next episode next week on The Sago Show. My name's Rachel. Salamat.